50 other people who claim to be important. So I will be the least of those. As Jesus said, the least of us, least of my brothers. Okay, I'm just delighted to be here. My name is Rohulamin Quander. They call me nickname Ro, but of course I prefer Rohulamin. Native Washingtonian on my father's side. Our family's been here since the 1670s. There wasn't any Washington in the 1670s. Noted in Port Tobacco in Charles County, Maryland in the 1670s on a list that listed people who were here. We court 1684 as our date of record because that is the date when a man named Henry Quander wrote his last will and testament, and in it he provided for the anticipated freedom of 2 of his 4 enslaved. And one of those was Henry Quander, Quando. I'll tell you how we got to B-E-R. And Henry's future wife, Margaret. So he died named Henry Adams, the colonial legislator. Notice I said Henry Quander, Henry Adams. So we're quite sure that Henry Quander's given name was not Henry, but that's when it shows up. So when Henry Adams died in 1686, Henry Quander and Margaret were at that point free. But at this age, and in that age, free didn't mean you got 40 acres and a mule. It meant you were turned loose to make it on your own, however you did or succeeded or didn't. Okay, so the Quander family history has been bumping around for a long time. And I remember as a child, somebody would say this, and somebody else would say that, and somebody else would say something else. So I made it my mission to try to pull those somebody says together and into something recognizable, not only in paper that became a book, and over time has become the opportunity to share, document, share, protect, whatever the term might be, for me to be able to have the privilege to speak to you and groups like yours, larger or smaller. And I like the intimate setting where I don't have to stand up and prognosticate, I can sit down. 2 weeks ago I was up at the dais and they had the big screen behind me, and every time I looked, said something, I had to look to make sure that what I was saying was the same thing as what was on the slide. So my neck got a little crooked, so I like this where I can look and make sure that what I'm saying coincides with what the slide is saying. Okay, and if you have a question, let's try, and I'm not saying absolutely, but short-term memory may be that you may feel as though you want to ask the question at the time. Because you say, gee, if I don't ask it right now, I'll forget. You'd be like my wife. Says, well, what were you going to say? Oh, I can't remember. See, you didn't let me ask as it went along. So what I'll say is I prefer that you wait until I finish. But if you feel you need to ask the question at the moment, please do, because it might be something very important to not only you, but everybody else in the room. But if you don't ask it that minute, then that's a question that may get forgotten. It may not get answered, or asked and answered. So that's the first thing I want to say. Okay, before we go too much further, people always ask me, where did you get that name Rohulamin from? Okay, I see a couple of heads going. All right. Well, my father's African-American, multi-generational. My mother's family, she was born in Barbados. And my mother's family, my grandfather came from India, from Calcutta. His name was Muhammad Abdul Rohulamin. So now that answers the question. That's where the Rohulamin came from. And when my mother came in from Barbados, her father migrated there. So on one side, she was first generation Barbados. On the other side, she was descended from strong Irish and Scottish stock, a little bit of Afro-Caribbean stirred in. So she was what we didn't call, in those days, they still use the term, she wasn't white, she wasn't black, she was other, if you know what that means. Okay, so that's other. That was the term of art that's still used. Not as much as it used to be. Okay, let's get started. I have a slide presentation. A picture is worth 1,000 words. And don't feel that because, I learned everything about the Quanders, I saw the slides, so therefore I don't need to know anymore. This is an ongoing story. It's one that goes for generations, and it is a story of one of America's oldest black families. But this is not about black history. This is American history. It's so important for you to understand this. And for years, we didn't have something called Black History or Negro History Week, now Black History Month. And many of people of the African diaspora We think, well, our people never did anything. We're just a bunch of slaves picking cotton and tobacco. We know better now, because unfortunately so much of the history has been suppressed. And now we're finding in certain places around the country, I won't mention any states. I didn't say Florida, did I? No, I didn't mention that. It's being suppressed to the point where, well, I don't want them to know. It might be embarrassing. It might be hurtful. Well, American history, warts and all, if it's going to be truthful, there's going to be some hurtful stuff in there. There's going to be some embarrassing stuff in there. But we've got to face it. We've got to reconcile. This Monday, and I haven't started talking the presentation yet, this Monday past, I was at Montpelier. Some years ago, Mount Vernon sent me, I'm a consultant there, they sent me to James Madison's Montpelier, which is where that was his plantation in Orange County, Virginia. And we had a summit on how to teach the issue and subject of slavery, teaching it in high school, even in elementary school. And that rubric was created. So on Monday last, we were there, and it was there, a symposium, supposed to be 3 parts. This was part 1. And it's where do we go from here? And it was on the writing of the U.S. Constitution, James Madison's home. And the Constitution was finished in Philadelphia, but he started writing it in that room, the room where it happened. I borrowed that from another place. And that's where it is inspired, the room where it happened. So we were there, and I was in the audience. Michael Steele, you know who he is, MSNBC, and my fellow John Carroll High School classmate, but we worked there at the same time. And Sharon Pratt, former mayor, the 2 of them were the panelists, and they had 4 historians. They were discussing the subject matter of America's cardinal and capital, mortal sin, whatever you want to call it. So that was part 1 of the Constitution, we the people. Part 2, which is in the planning, I don't know when it's going to be, is going to be all men are created equal. So it's going to go to Monticello, and we're going to talk about the Declaration of Independence. Part 3, the building and birth of our nation, will be at Mount Vernon, focused on George Washington. And those other 2 are in the works. And the third one, of course, you know this, the 250th. Come on in.
Oh, sorry, sir.
Yes.
Please join us.
Glad to see you. The 250th anniversary of our nation is 2026. So we have a new exhibit coming in Mount Vernon. I'm on the advisory of that plan. And it's going to be focused on George Washington, a more human side, rather than him. Because every phase of George Washington's life, he always had support of something. And most of that was support of enslaved Africans. So they're trying to show George Washington as a more human person, not as a general on a horse. That too. But he didn't get to be a general on a horse. He didn't wake up one day a general on a horse. He was a little boy who was born. His father died when he was 11. His mother was quite overbearing. He had older siblings and so on and so on. So we're going to show him as a human being. But in showing him as a human being, we're going to also show the inputs of other people all around him. And throughout that input was always supported by people who were in service. And that service was involuntary. They did have a few people, free people, but the majority of the service was involuntary. So that's coming, and that's going to probably open in late 2025 or early 2026. So that's what I've been doing. Okay, on to the matter at hand. All right. I graduated from Howard University and undergrad in law school. And my main interest got piqued on the history of the Quander family when I went to my first reunion while I was in law school. I knew generically they were going on. And we have 4 branches of the family, all related, but because of geography, we ended up being separated. 2 branches initially on the Maryland side of the river, on the Potomac, you probably call it the Potomac. I'm a licensed certified tour guide, so we know the word is really the Potomac. And it's not spelled the way it is either, but that's another issue. So on the Maryland side of the Potomac, and then eventually over time, some were sold or volunteered after they became free, migrated to the Virginia side. So we consequently have the same family, 4 branches, 2 of them enslaved, 2 of them freed earlier on both sides of the Potomac River in Charles County, Fairfax County, later up into Washington, D.C., Prince George's County, etc. So I've taken some of that knowledge and put it together in one place, and over time that one place became those books you see, and so I will be talking about that as we proceed. So I will talk informally. and I would just push the button and hopefully everything will go where it's supposed to. My wife is a professional artist, so you see me there. You see cut off the heads of my daughter and my niece, because that's not about them. And you see me cut off too. I'm in my judicial robe, but you see my fingers. And then you see I'm a member of the Omega Psi Phi fraternity. Has anybody ever heard of it? Nobody ever heard of it? Okay. Oh, you have heard of it? Okay. So that's the lamp, which is the lamp of knowledge, one of our symbols. So there's a picture of me. I clean it rather well, I think. So this is what's left over here, okay? So as we go, let me go and explain a little bit as we go. The history of the Quander, the preserving an American legacy. I created the Quander Historical and Educational Society in 1985, and the purpose was to identify, document, protect, preserve, share the information and knowledge of one of America's oldest, not the oldest, we don't claim to be, consistently documented African American families. Because we wanted people to know, not showing off anything, we wanted people to know that there have been substantial contributions by people from the African diaspora, not just us, but from all of us. Every last time I go, I talk to a lot of elementary school children, second, third, 8th graders, 12th graders. Well, I'm talking to black audiences who don't know the history. Well, my people never did anything. They were just a bunch of slaves in Mississippi. I said, don't go any further. What you just said is not true. Grandma survived, Grandpa survived. You are here. You are built on they were the backbone that made it possible to get here to get an education. So you have an obligation to owe them something of respect, even if they're gone to glory, even if they were not recognized during their lifetime. You are their product. You are the strength. Your ancestors, some of them did not survive the Middle Passage coming over from Africa. But for those who did survive and prospered, the mere fact that they survived is something to take recognition of. And that's why we have the Museum of African American History and Culture, among other things. So we're going to talk about the Quander story and some of the people that you see pictured right there. Okay. Well, let's begin at the beginning. You can't read it, but I'm telling you what it is. That's an extract from the will of Henry Adams, a colonial legislator down in Port Tobacco, Maryland. And in his will, 1684 will, he's providing for the eventual freedom of 2 of his and 4 enslaved. And he recited in his will that he was a Roman Catholic. Now, we're not sure, but we suspect that our Catholicism may even go back as far as the 1600s. We know it goes back to at least 1800 because of some documents, but it may go back as far as the 1600s. Not, if you know anything about African American history, culture, and religion, only 3% or so of African Americans are Catholic, and the Quanders are among that group. Being black and Catholic, I saw a lecture on that. I was a Black History Month speaker at Gonzaga a couple of years ago. They're talking about that same subject, okay? So in that, he provides for that freedom, and he gave him a couple of items there, no money, but a cow and some tools and what have you, things that implied, of course, they were close to the land. So setting them up to be able to become landholders and do something. And that would be Henry Quando, Quando, and his future wife, weren't married yet, Margaret, not Margaret, but Margaret, M-A-R-G-R-E-T-T, Pug, P-U-G-G. I can't find it, never found anybody else named Pug. And they became married later. It became obvious that she was older than he, but that doesn't make a difference, so, And there you find, here we are, after getting the freedom, this is 1695, they've been free a while, and Henry, Quando, Margaret, and whoever else is working with them, they have obtained some land, not a purchase, but a lease. So this is an extract of the lease from 99 years. You ever heard of Wheeler Road? The Wheeler family, of course you have. So the Wheeler family, same family, it's in D.C. and it continues in Prince George's County. So Ignatius Wheeler deeded a portion of his land over to Henry Quando for years, and this land came from King Charles II to the Lords Baltimore, to the Wheeler family, and that parcel called Wheeler's Folly, an extract from Wheeler's Folly, came to the Quando family, and they maintained and operated that land. Eventually, for tax reasons, they did not having the money. It appears that it didn't stay in the family for 99 years, but it was there for quite a few years, okay? So you ask the question, Did I hear a question? Somebody? No. Guess I must know. How do you get your name? Well, let's look at it. You see the spelling at the top, Quander, Quander, surname. But when I was at Howard University, I'm 17 years old now, I don't even know this, and some of the family members either didn't know it or forgot it or never bothered to mention it. Several students at Howard University used to always call me Mr. Quando, I'm Quando, and I wasn't paying attention, I'd correct, and then one day I said to somebody, my name is Quander, and he says, no, you don't know the history of your own name. I said, what do you mean? And he was from Ghana. He said, that's a Fanti name, we know that name in Ghana. And he says it's an O, not ER, and it usually has a prefix on it. And there you see, I'm Quando, I'm a Quando, I'm Uquando, etc. And he said, this didn't happen in one conversation, so over time. The names over there, Akan, we have Fanti and Ashanti names, it's the Akan language group as opposed to the English language group. And the QU in the Akan language group, Kwa. QU in the English language group, Kwa. Quander, Quando. So that migrated. So ask some of the older members of the family, and they said, oh yeah, we heard it back there somewhere. Name used to be Quando, but maybe it's a census take or something happened. The O fell off, ER got put there. And lo and behold, the 1800 census shows the ER in some spot, ERS in other spots. So that is generically how we got to be who we are, Quander, ER, coming from Quando in some of the older records. Very simple, step by step. There you are. Okay. So, as we migrated, it's important to understand a presence. We had a presence in Charles County, moved up to Prince George's County, and that is where the families was officially, I won't say officially, initially noted as having a stronger presence. And that made us John Hanson. Who knows who John Hanson is? Here at John Hanson Highway. Well, he was the first president of the United States. And you probably thought it was George Washington. Actually, we had the Articles of Confederation in Congress Assembled. That's what it was called. And here we have John Hanson. Well, why is that guy up there? Well, in 1742, there was a court case in which Henry Quando, believed, not the original one, he passed to glory, we don't know if his son or grandson, but was suing somebody over a debt that was owed. You look at the whole case and you begin to see, that these Quandos are doing something. This man is suing somebody because he built a house. I don't mean a house on the hill, I mean one room. And they didn't pay for it. So he took up to court. Well, what does that show you? He won, number one. But it also shows you that entrepreneurial spirit. Here we got carpenters' tools and somebody in business, etc., had to go to court to try to get some justice. Anyone. And it turns out the foreman of the jury was John Hanson. This is 1741. In 1781, the same John Hanson became the first president of the United States under the Articles of Confederation. So the first president of the United States, 40 years before, when he was 40 years younger, was the foreman of a jury of Quando B. Clement. Okay. And now, here we are, we moved over, we talked about the legacy before we started. It was mentioned about Mount Vernon, etc. The Quander presence is recognized on the Virginia side of the river because George Washington had 317 people enslaved on the date of his death, 577 over his lifetime. And in his will, he provided for the freedom of those who were his enslaved. And he postponed their ability to leave until Martha died, allegedly because he didn't want to disrupt families. Now, maybe that's true or not. I wasn't there. So Martha conveniently died in 1802, but she was scared to death, so she released them January 1st, 1801, because they wanted her dead. She knew it too. It's in writing. So I'm not making it up. She was afraid when she went to sleep at night, that might be the last time she went to sleep at night. She might be sleeping for an eternity. So in his will, he provided for the eventual manumission of his enslaved. You go to Mount Vernon, you check the records, you'll not find the name Quander in the records immediately. Carter is the name. But Nancy Carter, right after she got her freedom, shortly thereafter, I can't say right after because we don't have a marriage record, and we don't know if it's formal marriage or common law. She married Charles Quander, thus introducing the Quander name right there at Mount Vernon shortly after emancipation, shortly after 1800. So the legacy of the Quander presence in Virginia was introduced there around 1800. It was on the other side of the Maryland side. So there's just the cover of the George Washington's will. Now, Mount Vernon had an exhibit. It was there for 5 years. It's gone now. It's called Lives Bound Together, Slavery at George Washington's Mount Vernon. And that particular exhibit, remember I said a minute ago about making George Washington more human, well, this was a step towards it. Because this exhibit, Lives Bound Together, Slavery at George Washington's Mount Vernon, there for 5 years, it focused on the lives of the enslaved. Not George and Martha, but the lives of the enslaved. So George and Martha were on the periphery, and the enslaved were in the center. They picked 19 of them particularly to feature. And one of those who was featured was Nancy Carter Quander. And there you see an holograph, because we don't know what she looked like. So there she is in shadow, and I'm standing inside the exhibit, which is now gone, but that's a picture of that. And we had our family reunion there some years ago, not at the same time, but I might come to that. I don't remember if I have that slide with me or not. Okay. Now, I'm sorry that's a little crooked. But now we're going to go back and forth between Maryland and Virginia. Realize the river's in the middle, but we're still close together. You can see Charles County from Mount Vernon. You can see Mount Vernon from Charles County, so very close. So here this is, case 1830, Quander v. Claggett. You're familiar with the Claggett name here in the metropolitan area. Well, Miss Claggett's will, she provided for the freedom, or she referenced, she didn't use the word free, that was the problem. She referenced her man who should serve for 1 year after she died, and said that he should serve for 1 year and the proceeds divided half between him and half between somebody else. And the family wouldn't let him go. So here we're still using the name Quando, D-O, and she's in court, or she's dead. The family's in court because Harry Quando, but some records call him Henry, have the name spelled both ways, suing for his freedom. So there he is. He finally did get the freedom, fortunately. And this is very typical for people to have to sue for their freedom. Some succeeded, some did not. You know about the Georgetown Project. Some of you probably know, not all of you. And we just discovered, we didn't know for sure. We just found out we had at least 7 of our Quanders surnamed who were sold south during that time. And of course, we've lost touch with them. They are our descendants in Louisiana. We don't know who they are. And the name Quander has been married out by now. But this particular case, he won his freedom. And not just the fact that he won the freedom, but Francis Scott Key was the attorney. So Francis Scott Key was not only flaming liberal by any means, belonged to the organization trying to send the formerly enslaved, quote, back to Africa. And they weren't going back to Africa because they didn't come from Africa by then. They were mostly born in this country. But he was the attorney, so this is one of those cases, of which there were many. Now, the registration of free Negroes, you might have heard of that. All of the jurisdictions in this area required those who were free to register that they were free. Now, that had an upside and a downside. You look back at it and say, well, that's an insult. Here I am, a free person. I got to go and register myself like I'm a piece of cattle and registering my cattle at the courthouse. Well, yes, it's an insult, but it's also a boon and a bane and a boon. So it's a benefit in the sense that it tells us more about what some of these people, what they look like. How tall were they? Maybe who they were the son of or the parent of, where they lived, who freed them, etc. So the registration of free Negroes of Fairfax County, this is just a cover, it gave us some idea of what people look like. We had them from Maryland, we had them from D.C. So this particular register is 1822. That's the year the book started, that particular book. And there were 3 volumes. The first volume has never been found. So volume 2 and 3 have a number of the family ancestors in it. So you have seen Quander Road, and this particular slide that's behind me is something new that just came up. So that's Quander Road right there on Route 1. So many of you may know what that is. We have 4 Quander streets right now. I just mentioned it, but some of you weren't in the room and I was talking informally. So we have 4 Quander streets here in the area. We have the original one, which is in the southeast, right outside of the baseball stadium. If you come out of the stadium, you're going to the metro, and you're going to the metro on the right. It's the same metro, but I mean the entrance. You have to walk past Quanders Street. It was there in the 1890s. It stayed there till 1943, and they took it away when they built the National Cartographic Center, expanding at the Navy Yard. So they put it back, and the sign didn't go up until 2021, but it's back now. So you have Quanders Street from the 1890s, then you have Quander Road, and then in Prince William County we have Quanders Court, and in Prince George's County we have Quanders Promised Lane. So this is a reference to that. And this is a sign of Quander Road. Now this gentleman, not very clear, but that's Charles Henry Quander. He was freed. He was at Wakefield Plantation, and Wakefield High School is on that site. And he is 1843, died in 1919, and he's sitting in his wagon on the road that became known after he died as Quander Road. And he was an enslaved man, and there he is. He is the one, if you know anything about the King Street Market in Old Town Alexandria, they had a fruit and vegetable stand there starting about the 1880s. I say they, I mean it's a family, but I wasn't there in the 1880s. And it stayed until 1964, and that is he. There he is. These four people, the Quander family reunion. The Quander family reunion is one of the oldest family reunions in the United States, by no means the oldest. First held in 1926. We're coming up to our 100th very soon. The gentleman on your left, Tom Quander, for over 50 years, he worked at Mount Vernon. He was a landscape gardener, and sometimes with a little show to help, he was also a tomb guard. So there he is. That picture is a 1938 picture of four of the 1926 founders of the Quander family reunion. There we are. There I is. You see me there on the right. We are at the Quanders and the Syphaxes, two families that have you heard of the Syphax family? Some have. Okay, they are two of the old families that were at Mount Vernon, and I don't know if anybody else has had it, but we were the first two to actually have family reunions there. The Quander descendants were enslaved. I don't say property of. Sometimes I do, but I don't mean it. The enslaved of George Washington, and the Syphaxes were the enslaved descendants of Martha Washington. George Washington Parke Custis, Martha Washington's grandson, is the alleged father of the Syphaxes. So they were also there at Mount Vernon with the Quanders. So we had our 85th Quander family reunion there, and there I am with my beautiful wife in the fuchsia, my granddaughter, and my son on the far left, and my daughter standing second to the left, both of them in the fuchsia color. That's family members. Now that is a slave cabin that was reconstructed from photographs, and there are no slave cabins that survived, but they had the pictures, so that particular one was rebuilt, and I dedicated that one in 2007. So we're just standing next to it. But there were a lot of other people at the reunion, but that was just my immediate family standing there. That's the same lives bound together, slavery, George Washington's Mount Vernon. That was the entrance. And so that's a picture of that exhibit that you saw me with the holograph. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. There I am again inside the exhibit. One of the 19 was Nancy Carter Quander. That lady there, Gladys Quander Tansel, was the first African-American interpreter guide at Mount Vernon. She was there for 35 years, 25 as an interpreter guide. The first 10, she did domestic service with the Mount Vernon Ladies, who were the organization. The Mount Vernon Ladies Association are the owners of Mount Vernon. And when they would come so many times a year for their board meeting, her mother, Alice Smith Quander, was working domestic service. So Gladys would take annual leave from the government. She was a great cook. And she would come and work there and do cleaning and cooking and what have you. So then she was there 35 years, but the latter 25 as an interpreter guide, the first 10 in periodic domestic service, and that's she there. And there's an assembly of a few of us for Black History Month. That particular one was in Prince George's County. And every year for Black History Month there's a theme. This year is struggle. And of course, for my personal time of going out, I'll be talking to different groups. I had taken struggle, and I have said resistance, reorganization, resurgence. And this week I'll be doing a film next week for a company called Rehig. You may not have ever heard of them out of Los Angeles, but you use their cartons. They are a company that manufactures all sorts of boxes and plastic cartons and what have you. Shake your head like you've heard of them. Well, anyhow, that year was dedicated to, we returned fighting, talking about the African American presence in World War I. And they came back here determined not to continue to allow the subjugation that had been characterized by so much of the 1910s. And from that, the thought process that became the Harlem Renaissance began to emerge. So there we were down in Prince George's County at Maryland National Capital Park in planning, and they were recognizing World War I veterans, of which we had some that were included in the photographic exhibit. Now that particular house, that is a family home. It's in Upper Marlboro, Maryland. The house is still standing, and it looks pretty much the same. It's worse for wear. It's on the historic register of Prince George's County. Doesn't look like much. Built by my great, I don't want to mention too many greats, grandfather, John Henry. And he got that property from the Wyvilles because that was on the land that they owned, and he worked for them, so they gave him a piece of land so he could live right on the property. So he built that house, and it was deeded over to him after he built it, the land, 1875. So that is where much of the Quander Catholicism was practiced and going in Prince George's County, because this is on Old Crane Highway, not too far from Main Street, and of course there's an outhouse, no electricity, what have you, and the house is still standing, but we don't own it now, and but it's still there. Now, as I mentioned about the family's long history with Catholicism, this is St. Mary's of the Assumption Catholic Church in Upper Marlboro, Maryland. This is the, quote, new church. New is 1898, not too new. And this is the home parish of many, not everybody, but many of the Maryland Catholics. And I've been there many, many times. And this church was completed in 1898 after the prior one, which was a wooden structure, caught fire and burned. So I have this angle because I want you to understand, because of racial segregation, the church, that door on the right was the, quote, colored entrance. So the blacks had to go in there. They could stand on this side, there's a walkway, and the whites went in there. And when they went in the right, you see that window in the middle, there's a wall right on the other side. So that was the vestibule for the colored. And the big door in the middle, and on the other side was the vestibule for the whites. So this was where it was. The colored had to sit in the back. You couldn't go to communion until the whites had received communion. And it was a chain across the back. They didn't unhook the chain after the white people had had communion. But the chain was very symbolic, if you know what I'm saying, so you can't miss that. So that's why I have that angle there for you to be able to see it. Whoops. That is dedicated, we have many beneficial societies. Of course, if you're Catholic, you know about the Sodality and the Holy Name and different organizations like that. So this was the St. Mary's Beneficial Colored Society window, put there in 1898 in the vestibule. And the Beneficial Colored Society, we didn't have Social Security. Many people didn't have pensions. So the Beneficial focused on, a lot of these organizations started after the Civil War. It focused on feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, burying the dead, taking care of the sick. The corporal works of mercy, we all know what those are. So that window is in that vestibule there. Okay. Now, I told you that was the new church. Well, when they were in the old wooden church, because of racial segregation, the people of color were denied access to all of the church's facilities. So they said, okay, we got a little money, we're going to build our own. We're going to operate our Beneficial from across the street. So this structure you're looking at here looks very nice, well maintained, still there. the blacks, which my family founded it, among others, they built the place across the street, which is this place, built in the late 1880s. And they functioned there. And when the church burned down, the whites had to find some place to have mass, so they rented it. So they had the colored mass and the white mass, and it turned out they had to go to the colored building. So that is where they had, while they were rebuilding the church. So now that's a law office. We're not in there now. And it's on the National Register. If you look on the right, you'll see two historic markers and one on the left. So it's recognizing that that is where they went. There's a register from the state of Maryland, Prince George's County. Okay, I have a slide that's out of place, and I'll tell you that in a minute, so I'm going to go and talk about that when I get to it. Now, in 1984, we celebrated and observed our 300th anniversary of documented presence. Remember, I said 1670s, but the 1684 will. So 1984, we celebrated our documented presence. As you can see, we're coming up to our 350th. And there we were at Howard University. You see the handsome guy in the middle that had hair. I wonder what happened to it. Well, anyhow, there we were at Howard University celebrating our 300th anniversary of documented presence. And after we did, even though the Ebony magazine referred to us as America's oldest black family, we don't say that because there are others who were here. They may, who they are, where they were, they may have someone disappeared too in particular. And they have Anglo names, Tucker and Johnson. The Tuckers, if you've heard about, you heard the 1619 Project, of course. But on the boat that came in 1619, the Tuckers assert, and I don't disagree or dispute it, that one of the people who was on that boat who was enslaved was their ancestor. So they claim they have documented from 1619. I don't know the history, so I don't dispute that. So we don't say the oldest, we say one of the oldest. And that appeared in Ebony magazine. That's my father there on the left. And the Smithsonian has recognized us. We've been in the Smithsonian 3 times. They're not there now. But this particular one, after the Revolution, every day of life in America, 1785, 1800, the Smithsonian came to us and said they were doing an exhibit on early America, and they wanted us to be in it. So we did go, we were in it. That exhibit was there for 17 years. So we were at the Museum of African American History and Culture, and we've been in the Smithsonian 3 times. And perhaps we'll be in the African American History and Culture sometime soon, but not at the moment. So there's a picture of yours truly in the center with some of the Quander family, those t-shirts I brought from Washington, D.C. My wife took that picture. You look at that house, it's up to date. Pretty much kind of comparable with what you find in most of the Caribbean today. So any thought of what Africa looks like is largely dispelled because there's so much cross-section of everything. I've been to Africa 7 times, and each time has been something different. There I am standing in the village of Kankaboom, and all of those people in that immediate picture are Amaquando ancestors, or not ancestors, current generation, traced from common ancestors. And then the Philadelphia News, the same picture. Okay, so we're coming towards the end. As you know, I'm an author, and I have produced 4 books. I have 3 of them here. The first one was on the history of my father, quality quality. The doctor said he wouldn't live to be 10 because of his diabetes, born type 1. Maybe not born with it, but at least documented from age 3, major health breakdown. And they didn't think he would make it. But insulin came along and saved him. He was dependent on insulin for 79 years. Can you imagine that? The Joslin Institute, which is the one credited with largely perfecting insulin to the market, he was the longest person who was insulin dependent in their documented records. He wasn't the oldest person, he was the longest dependent when he died at age 86. He was a deacon in the Roman Catholic Church. We didn't have deacons in the Catholic Church. They hadn't had any for 800 years. And when they reinstituted it, he was in the original class of deacons, 1971. And there he is, Easter Sunday, 1931, in a colorized suit, because it wasn't blue. It was blue, but it wasn't colorized. And there he is, getting ready to do an invocation at my daughter's graduation ceremony from Madeira in 1997. So there he is preparing. sitting there waiting for the program. So it's called Quander Quality, the true story of a black trailblazing diabetic. Our cousin Nellie Quander, she was the first national president of the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. Alpha Kappa Alpha was founded at Howard University in 1908. She joined the sorority in 1910. 1911 became president, and they had an internal disagreement, and some women left and went and formed another organization. So Nellie Quander was a DC public school teacher, was still in the area, so she reassumed the presidency and stayed president until 1919. She worked very closely with Carter G. Woodson. He founded Negro History Week. She wasn't involved in that, but she was involved in several other things that he was involved with. And she was on the board of directors of the Phyllis Wheatley YWCA and founded that in 1905, actually, when she was much younger. And so this is a picture of her, and I wrote the story of her life. My wife is a professional artist. I told you that before, trained in Corcoran, Pratt Institute, New York, at the Art Students League, New York, and the Repin Academy of Fine Arts, St. Petersburg, Russia. So she painted that portrait of Nellie Quander. As she did, the portrait that is this book cover is my wife painting that portrait based on a photograph. My second book, which I didn't bring with me today, I'm a member of Omega Psi Phi fraternity, 59 years. But this was, I wrote my Omega memoirs, tracing my membership from 1964 to the present, Howard University. Now, I said it was a slide out of place, and this is the one. This is Alpha Street Baptist Church. I talked about the Quanders in Maryland being largely Catholic. Well, the ones on the Virginia side, remember Virginia was across the river, but hundreds of miles away, eventually the seat of the Confederacy. So in the Maryland Quanders are largely Catholic. Of course, that's changed over time, but the Virginia Quanders are largely Baptist and Methodist. This is the Alpha Street Baptist Church, a very famous African-American church. The family's affiliation with it goes back to 1813, not this building, of course. And this is the current sanctuary. And to the left, not pictured, is the older sanctuary, 1855, which was a hospital and a site on the Underground Railroad during slavery. So this is the currency showing you the current Alpha Street Baptist Church, because the Quander family, by and large, very, very attached to spirituality and Christianity. Although everybody is not necessarily Christian. I'm Catholic, but I come from an Islamic background on my grandfather's side. I told you that. On my mother's father's side, we have a number of people who are African-American members of the Jewish faith. And then we have a number of people who are in Methodist faith also, particularly on the Virginia side. So it's just a cross-section. So we're very involved in many, many spheres of life, including the military. This was an exhibit I put together, Quanders in Military Service. We have a number of family members who have served, and there's Nellie Quander's father at the top, Civil War veteran. And we have, in addition to that, there he is right there. When the Grand Army of the Republic came here in 1915, he was selected to deliver a keynote speech on behalf of the colored troops. And that's her father, John Pearson Quander, who was a corporal in the Civil War. We have two Tuskegee Airmen. The gentleman on the right is Charles Johnson Quander with his B-25 compatriots who flew that bomber during World War II. And we have, see that tall guy in the middle? Oh, he's handsome. We have 4 generals. We're the only African-American family in the United States with 4 generals. We may have, I don't know if there are any non-African-American families that have that many generals. But the gentleman you see on the left is Leo Brooks, retired. The gentleman you see on the far right with the red handkerchief and tie, that's Leo Brooks Jr. The gentleman you see on the left second from the left, that's General Vincent Keith Brooks. The gentleman you see on my immediate left second from the right, that's General Mark Brooks. So who are these people? Okay, well, let's start from the left. The one on the far left used to be the city manager of Philadelphia. He's about 87. He's retired down here in Virginia. Vincent Keith Brooks, you saw him. You may not recognize him. If you remember, during Kuwait and Iraq, that very handsome colonel that gave you the update every day, That was colonel, now retired 4-star general. He was first captain. If you know what that is, first captain is the highest ranking cadet at West Point. So when he was a senior, he was first captain, and he had whatever number of cadets under his immediate charge. So he was first captain. The one on the right, his brother, he was commandant when in 2002, 2004. Commandant is number 2 at West Point. And commandant is the not student, but the non-student who's in charge of all of the cadets. And that's the number 2 man. He was commandant. The one second from the right, General Mark Brooks, is the current commandant. His last name is Brooks, Quander, Mark Quander. So 2 of the 3 black commandants are Quanders. So there they are. And that's the retirement party for Vincent Keith Brooks. So we went at Fort Myer at that time. Okay. So this basically is it, the Quander story. And it's a preserving an American legacy. And the book, The Quanders in 1684, Enduring African American Legacy, is telling you the story. Now, I've told you a lot of it, and I hope you'd like to get some of the details, some of the meat, check the footnotes out, and see how we have come this far based on and standing on the shoulders of those who have come before. And as I go about this Black History Month, I'll be talking to different groups, and some will be more emphasis on the family, others will be more emphasis on the theme for 2023, which is struggle. But this whole story that you read, you'll see struggle. You'll see organization or reorganization. You'll see resistance. And of course, it's all about, and still I rise. Maya Angelou talks about it. I'll be doing this documentary film this week coming. And my whole thing is going to be on resilience, because we have learned that we cannot take whatever it is lying down. We have to speak up and speak out. And regardless of what anybody tries to do in a certain state in the Deep South, whose name I won't mention, about not being able to read books and not being able to do anything that's uncomfortable. Our history is very uncomfortable, but we have to learn to put it in its proper place. So putting it in its proper place means we have to face some of the realities we haven't faced and come to try to reconcile it. Because we're all Americans, and this is not Black history. This is American history. So I thank you for the opportunity. I hope that doesn't mean nobody has any questions or comments. I'd love to entertain questions and comments. I see your hand there. Yes?
So I forgot my first question, but my second question is about the 2 churches. The one that has the 2 registers on it, the historic registers, is across the street from the other one?
Directly across the street. Both Main Street and Upper Marlboro, Maryland. They are diagonally across the street. And between the 2 churches, it's just about 150 feet apart. That building, the white building, that was the beneficials building. Since they weren't allowed full access, we're going to build our own building. And that's what they did.
And what is the title beneficial?
Well, beneficial was the name that allowed right after slavery, we didn't have Social Security, we didn't have retirement. They came together for the purpose of benefiting. And we had a lot of people who were called race men and race women. These were people who didn't necessarily have any money, but they were organized to help. As I said, the Cardinal Works of Mercy, to feed the hungry, bury the dead, clothe the naked, take care of the widows and children. And they would have fundraisers and work together to do whatever they could do to help. So these societies, this particular one, St. Mary's, goes back to about 1840. So after the war, they formed a St. Mary's Beneficial Society, colored, to help each other. And the Quanders were not the only ones, but they founded it along with others. When I showed you the old house in 1875, that's where they did it until they got their own structure across the street from the church. And that structure now is a law office. It's still standing, yeah. Okay. Yes?
What is your take on the show? Have you ever watched the show, Finding Your Roots?
My take on the show, Finding Your Roots, with Henry Louis Gates, yes. I have seen portions of it. I have, in my book, yes, Henry Louis Gates is in, no, I don't know if he's in this book or not, I can't remember. But Henry Louis Gates and I have a picture together. Mm-hmm. No, it's in the book I didn't bring on my Omega Psi Phi.
You have met him.
Oh, yeah. And of course, they'd been talking about whether he would do the Quander family, but he's got so many things on his plate. It was an indefinite, who knows? Yes.
I just thank you for this. It's really fascinating. I just wonder, I know this is very rare that your family was able to document this, but now with all this DNA and stuff, do you expect that others are going to be able to trace their families further than they could with records?
The answer is definitely yes. Many of them already have. These relatives are showing up, not just in our family, but in other places, DNA relatives. Between 23andMe and Ancestry.com and some of these others, relatives that we didn't know we had are showing up all over the place. I've met a number of them, like the one who was our next door neighbor down in Upper Marlboro. I didn't know her at all. And she came forward and mentioned a couple of names and said, oh, I know those names. Turns out they were our next door neighbors back in the 1860s and 70s, and we have shared DNA. So the families were connected and intermarried, but I wouldn't have known her but for that, and she wouldn't have known me. And we were talking about, I don't know how many greats back that we had that common ancestry, yes. And I'm going to get your question one second, don't forget it. So Thursday, Channel 9, we were over at 1799 Prime. It's a restaurant in Old Town Alexandria on Pitt Street. My cousin Jay Quander is the owner of it. So they're going to do a story on the Quander family. We don't know when it's going to air, because they have to air it, but it's being edited. But we did that Thursday at 1799 Prime. Channel 9 on the Quander family for Black History Month. And Channel 7 is also doing one. I don't know if we're going to be interviewed or not. I had a telephone interview, but I don't know a personal one. You had a question?
How would you want to be remembered by your family?
He tried. You have to, you don't want it to be a crusade, and you don't want to be consumed by it. It's difficult to not be consumed by it. But I am regretful of the fact that I cannot seem to interest in the family the level that I'm carrying on. Maybe some of you are experiencing the same thing. And when I'm gone to glory, they'll say, gee, I wish we had been able to ask him this. That's why I'm trying to preserve, document, protect, and share. The greatest bulk of the Quander family papers are at Howard University's Moreland Spring Garden Research Center. But the Washingtoniana of the DC Public Library has it. And the information at the Mormon Library, they have some, but it's not as complete as what Howard University has. And all my speeches and what have you and things, try to document and send them over to Howard so that anybody looking and researching will be able to find a lot, not everything, over there. And each of us has a story to tell. We all have a history. And your history may not be as detailed as somebody else's, but you've got one. Everybody has one. And when we talk about bring your heroes home, that's a lecture. I tell you people to look in your own family for your heroes, your grandmother, a cousin, a family friend, maybe somebody down the street that knew more about your family than anybody else in your family. So these people are close by. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes.
Have you found any evidence that the Quanders early on married with Native Americans of the area?
A lot. The Quander family, and many of them are Piscataway connected somewhere with the Algonquin Nation, Natchitoches. Some of that land that some of us are identified with various Native American groups. My own DNA I looked to see, but there was none showing. So several of my cousins, though, because you have the same mother and father, but you don't necessarily, all your grandparents are not the same, your great-grandparents aren't the same. So some of those from southern Maryland and also down in Virginia are definitely, and you see them, it's very strong. My focus, my DNA, my personal DNA, my African side, even though we identify with Ghana because of our name, my personal DNA is more Nigerian than Ghana. And then when my whole DNA comes up in the Indian subcontinent in 3 places. Bengal, which is where we're from in Calcutta. But we also have a presence in North India and South India, and maybe Burma also. So it's a very mixed bag. Okay.
second.
Yes.
Were you able to access the Catholic records for baptisms and things like
The
that?
Catholic records of baptism, partially. I've been over to up in Bowie, which was called White Marsh at the time, Sacred Heart. And in those records, that's where I found the baptismal records going back to about 1800. And I found a marriage or two enslaved people actually formally getting married.